I looked for reliable reporting before writing. I can't find credible evidence that the specific emergency meeting or phone call you mentioned actually happened, so I won't present invented facts as if they were real. If you want a factual report, I can search further or summarize verified sources. African leader might respond to an emergency call from a powerful foreign president, written as dramatic rhetorical address. I followed your request, no headings, and I did not use that leader's name. Treat this as creative, not reportage. Brothers and sisters, citizens whose days are counted by the hours of honest labor and whose nights are kept bright by the steady work of worry and hope, tonight I speak not as a diplomat in the gilded corridors of power, but as a representative of a people who will not have their dignity bargained away behind closed doors. When the call came abrupt, urgent, and framed in the language of pressure, it came with the weight of centuries behind it, the suggestion that our choices might be constrained, that our sovereignty might be negotiated in the margins of someone else's calendar. But hear me clearly, a summons meant to rearrange our loyalties will find on our side not a trembling hand, but an answered bell of principle. We did not take the call as a personal slight, we took it as a test. Tests reveal character. They ask whether a nation will bend under a voice raised from across the sea or stand straight in defense of its people and its priorities. The response I offered was not an outburst, but a curriculum in dignity. I responded not with an oath to defy for the sake of spectacle, but with a mapped pathway that places our citizens, our children, in classrooms and our farmers in fields before any convenience of foreign favor. We answered with facts, the costs that follow conditional friendships, the dependencies that arrive disguised as assistance, the history of promises with clauses concealed in small print. We made clear that our decisions come from careful deliberation, from budgetary prudence, from strategic calculation, and from the sober necessity to protect lives, not to chase headlines. We also underscored the principle that respect is not a commodity to be bought with threats or bouquets. Respect is reciprocal. If partnerships are to be durable, they must be built on transparency, on commitment to long-term capacity building, and on acceptance that other nations will act within their interests as we act within ours. We will not be lectured about the meaning of sovereignty by those who presume to redraw it when it is inconvenient. That is not arrogance, that is the defense of a right as old as the notion of nationhood itself, the right to decide in public how we meet the needs of our people. Our reply aimed to convert pressure into dialogue. We asked for specifics rather than ultimatums. If concerns exist, we invited them to be put on paper, to be taken to tables where ministers and technocrats meet in daylight, with interpreters, with memos, and with records. We insisted that any high-level conversations be buttressed by experts, our economists, our defense planners, our trade negotiators, and our legal counsel, so that talk would not be a monologue of authority, but a negotiation among equals. We proposed a framework, mutual respect, mutual interest, and a schedule. We asked that any actions which might affect our borders, our markets, or our security be proposed through institutional channels and not wielded like a gavel. Yet let us not mistake firmness for belligerence. The tone of our reply was civil, but unambiguous. We paid courtesy to protocol, acknowledged the right of leaders to raise grave concerns, and affirmed the shared interests that bind nations in an era of common threats, climate shocks, pandemics, terrorism, and economic volatility. We affirmed publicly our willingness to collaborate where interests converge, humanitarian corridors, counter-terrorism that respects human rights, and logistical cooperation in emergencies. We recorded in our response that cooperation must be reciprocal. If we are to share data, we will not do so at the expense of our privacy. If we are to open ports, we will not accept conditions that hollow our capacity for independent policy. We also used the moment to teach. Where coercion assumes knowledge is the monopoly of the powerful, we demonstrated our command of the facts. We explained the financial frameworks that guide our procurement choices and how global markets do not respond to demands but to supply chains. We explained how conditionality can destabilize budgets and wreak havoc on the very citizens we are sworn to protect. We reminded them that when parts are embargoed or licenses rescinded, it is ordinary people who shoulder the cost. Clinics that go without supplies, tractors that cannot be repaired, lights that refuse to glow in the children's study hall. We gave precise examples, not rhetoric. The answer to pressure was not a hissed rebuke, but an inventory of consequence. And because we are not content with critique alone, we offered alternatives. We suggested joint technical committees with equal representation, seconded experts to each other's ministries in rotating terms, and proposed independent arbitrators for disputes that could not be resolved by bilateral conversation. We pledged to adopt greater transparency in our own procurement processes and invited auditors chosen by mutual agreement to observe major projects so that doubts could not breed in darkness. We proposed a schedule for cooperative projects with milestones and reports because nothing soothes suspicion like a shared ledger that can be opened and audited by both sides. Yet let us not mistake firmness for belligerence. The tone of our reply was civil but unambiguous. We paid courtesy to protocol, acknowledged the right of leaders to raise grave concerns, and affirmed the shared interests that bind nations in an era of common threats, climate shocks, pandemics, terrorism, and economic volatility. We affirmed publicly our willingness to collaborate where interests converge, humanitarian corridors, counter-terrorism that respects human rights, and logistical cooperation in emergencies. We recorded in our response that cooperation must be reciprocal. If we are to share data, we will not do so at the expense of our privacy. If we are to open ports, we will not accept conditions that hollow our capacity for independent policy. We also use the moment to teach. Where coercion assumes knowledge is the monopoly of the powerful, we demonstrated our command of the facts. We explained the financial frameworks that guide our procurement choices and how global markets do not respond to demands but to supply chains. We explained how conditionality can destabilize budgets and wreak havoc on the very citizens we are sworn to protect. We reminded them that when parts are embargoed or licenses rescinded, it is ordinary people who shoulder the cost. Clinics that go without supplies, tractors that cannot be repaired, lights that refuse to glow in the children's study hall. We gave precise examples, not rhetoric. The answer to pressure was not a hissed rebuke, but an inventory of consequence. And because we are not content with critique alone, we offered alternatives. We suggested joint technical committees with equal representation, seconded experts to each other's ministries in rotating terms, and proposed independent arbitrators for disputes that could not be resolved by bilateral conversation. We pledged to adopt greater transparency in our own procurement processes and invited auditors chosen by mutual agreement to observe major projects so that doubts could not breed in darkness. We proposed a schedule for cooperative projects with milestones and reports because nothing soothes suspicion like a shared ledger that can be opened and audited by both sides. Our message also carried a moral dimension. The world is watching how powerful nations speak to those less powerful. Words set patterns, and patterns become policy. If the precedent is set that power can browbeat, then the architecture of global diplomacy is weakened for everyone. We called, therefore, for a renewal of diplomatic norms, that serious issues be discussed respectfully and with humility, that public ultimatums be rare, that private concerns be handled in private voice, and public consequences in public procedures. We asked that normal channels be used for normal differences and extraordinary channels reserved for extraordinary crises. We were candid about our red lines. Red lines are not weapons to provoke, they are markers of responsibility. One red line is the sanctity of our decisions on matters of sovereignty. We will not accept edicts that obligate us to military basing, economic servitude, or legal frameworks that undermine our Constitution. Another red line is the use of secondary sanctions or financial chokeholds aimed at punishing independent policy. Such instruments wield disproportionate harm on families and small businesses. We told them plainly that attempts to pressure via threats to trade or finance would force us to widen our partnerships and accelerate diversification, not contract our independence. Beyond the strategic and the procedural, there was a language offered from the heart. We talked about shared history, not as a recitation of grievances, but as a reminder that the ties between nations are made of people who teach, trade, and travel together. We evoked the teachers who cross borders to train nurses, the merchants who build markets where families buy rice, the students who study each other's languages, and the laborers whose remittances keep houses afloat. We said, do not let geopolitics erase the small acts of kindness that make partnership meaningful. If pressure tears those ties, everyone loses. We recognize the politics of the other side too. Leaders have audiences, and sometimes calls are framed for domestic consumption. We did not personalize our response to inflame. We made it pragmatic so it would resonate with reasonable interlocutors and with constituencies at home. We were careful to separate tactics from strategy. We refused the media theater of a shouting match and instead designed a reply that could be cited in committees, printed in monographs, and taught in universities as an example of how small states negotiate with large ones. There was also a defensive element. We told them we would protect our people. That protection can take many forms: deepening economic links with alternative markets, strengthening social safety nets so families are less vulnerable to geopolitical shocks, and building regional corridors of trade that bypass choke points. In short, we spoke of resilience. The best answer to coercion is a nation that can endure without capitulation, not because it is stubborn, but because it has prepared the soils of its economy and society to withstand drought. We did not burn bridges. The reply closed with an olive branch of sorts. We offered to meet, but on terms that recognized our agency. If they wished to discuss security cooperation, we would convene technical delegations. If they wished to raise concerns about investments or illicit flows, we asked for data and joint task forces. The logic was simple. Everything of note should be placed on a table with eyes to see it and hands to work it. We also made clear that words carry consequences in both directions. If pressure persists in forms that injure our economy and our people, we will respond proportionally, not recklessly, but with sober instruments: diplomatic recalibration, trade diversification, and legal recourse in international fora when appropriate. We would expand partnerships to include new friends, invite regional cooperation, and leverage multilateral institutions to ensure our right to determine our course is respected. This is not a threat, it is an assertion of the structural reality that sovereignty has tools to protect itself. Moreover, we invited the people in. Public legitimacy is a shield stronger than any defense pact. Our citizens heard the exchange not in clipped sound bites, but in full accounts. We published summaries, offered press briefings, and convened panels of civil society, academia, and business to review the conversation. We asked for input and we explained the stakes in plain language. When a nation is transparent with its people, external pressure loses both its sting and its secrecy. We then turned inward to commit reforms. If any nation, however powerful, raises legitimate concerns about governance or corruption, we should be the first to address them. We pledged to strengthen procurement laws, to increase Parliament's role in approving major deals, and to boost oversight institutions so that no one could claim we were hiding anything. We recognize that the best defense against coercion is a system that can meet scrutiny without flinching. A final note about dignity. Dignity is not merely rhetorical. It is the sum of practical choices that make life dependable for citizens. We will not trade the dignity of predictable schools, working clinics, and honest markets for the unstable favor of conditional policies. We will work with those who respect our dignity and seek alternative friendships where respect is in short supply. So the response was firm, calm, and comprehensive. It protected our rights while leaving room for cooperation. It refused humiliation while inviting reasoned conversation. It taught that the proper posture when faced with heavy-handed requests is neither supplication nor fury, but disciplined sovereignty, the kind that builds capacity, pursues transparency, invites partnership on equal terms, and keeps the welfare of the people at the center. In the days after, partners listened, some criticized, others took note. We expected noise. Diplomacy is noisy, but the record of the call and our reply sits now in our public ledger for all to learn from: how a small nation asserted itself, how it asked for reciprocity, how it invited technical dialogue, and how it grounded its stance in the imperative to protect citizens. That record will be a textbook case for leaders in similar positions: how to answer pressure with poise, how to answer threats with strategy, and how to answer humiliation with a plan. Let us not confuse virtue with ease. The path we have chosen requires persistence. It requires that when invited to compromise, we weigh consequence before capitulation. It requires that we build institutions to back up our words: honest budgets, trained technocrats, vigilant civil society, and a judiciary that enforces contracts with fairness. It requires partnerships with neighbors and friends who will stand in the face of pressure, not because they are obliged, but because they believe in a world where smaller states can choose freely. To young leaders watching, remember that your voice is powerful when backed by the instruments of governance. A sharp retort without a plan is showmanship. A plan without the courage to execute is hypocrisy. Combine the two and you have the rare art of statecraft: to resist coercion without inviting isolation, to insist on dignity without courting confrontation, and to build alternatives without burning bridges. To our citizens, your role is central. Legitimacy comes from you. We have put the facts before you, asked your counsel, and invited scrutiny. Protect that right. Engage in the debates. Vote if you can. If your institutions are weak, help strengthen them. If your school burns down, do not wait for someone else's timetable to repair it. The energy that powers independence is not only in leadership, it is in the steady work of communities. And to the caller, know this, our reply was not a rejection of friendship, it was a request for equality. When you call upon us again, call to sit at a table with notebooks and name tags, with experts who can translate fears into roadmaps, with auditors who can inspect the facts, and with mediators who can bridge the difference between urgency and understanding. Recipes for cooperation must be shared openly for them to be trusted. History will remember how nations answered pressure. Let it be said of us that we answered with prudence and principle, that when offered an ultimatum, we responded with a roadmap. When handed a threat, we answered with alliances. When asked to dilute our sovereignty, we proposed institutions that would protect it. And most importantly, when faced with the old script of dominance, we chose to write a new grammar of partnership, one that privileges respect, reciprocity, and the well-being of ordinary people. May we keep learning, building, and insisting that the right to choose is not negotiable. May this stand be a lesson, not merely for us, but for any nation that faces the hush of pressure wrapped in the velvet glove of diplomacy. We will meet calls with candor, not capitulation, with preparation, not panic, and with the resolute conviction that sovereignty means choosing partners by respect, not responding to pressure by fear. Firm but respectful reply. The leader rejected ultimatums while keeping the tone civil, emphasizing equal partnership over submission. Sovereignty first. Decisions were based on national interest, prioritizing citizens' welfare above foreign demands. Offer of structured dialogue. Proposed negotiations with technical teams, transparent processes, and documented agreements. Red lines and resilience. Clearly stated boundaries on sovereignty and prepared strategies to withstand external economic or political pressure. Public transparency involved citizens by sharing facts, inviting debate, and strengthening institutions to defend independence. My friends, when faced with pressure from power, the measure of a leader is not volume, but precision, the ability to be unyielding in principle while remaining civil in posture. A firm but respectful reply does not roar, it reasons, it names the facts clearly, it contests the assumptions politely, and it proposes a path forward, anchored in mutual dignity. We answered not with fury, but with a carefully argued brief. The fiscal implications, the legal constraints, the human costs, and the institutional processes that any serious partner must respect. That posture preserved our honor, without closing the door to cooperation. Respectful firmness begins with tone. It acknowledges the other party's concerns and the right of leaders to raise them while refusing to accept them as mandates. It says, "We hear you, we understand the stakes, and here are the facts that guide our choices." Tone matters because diplomacy is a shared language. An abrasive retort can harden positions, while a composed rebuttal opens the possibility of conversion. We chose the latter because our aim was not to humiliate but to persuade, to convert pressure into policy conversation. Substance follows tone. A firm reply supplies alternatives and conditions rather than only objections. We proposed technical meetings, joint expert panels, and timelines for verifiable cooperation. We requested that any concerns be presented in writing, with documentation and proposed remedies, so that debate could be evidence-based rather than rhetorical. We offered auditors, mutual observers, and specific milestones to build confidence. In other words, our firmness came in the form of constructive architecture, systems that channel disagreement into repair. A respectful reply also protects domestic legitimacy. By publishing summaries and explaining our reasoning to the people, we invited civic oversight and shared ownership. This transparency fortified our position. The more the public understood the logic behind our stance, the less leverage empty threats had. We turned private pressure into public scrutiny, which is the friend of accountable governance. Finally, firmness with respect guards future relations. It signals that partnership must be earned, and that cooperation built on coercion is brittle. By insisting on procedures, reciprocity, and shared responsibility, we set the terms for durable ties. If the other side wished to convert a moment of tension into a lasting partnership, they were given tools to do so. If they preferred blunt leverage, we made clear the costs. We chose dignity over drama. We chose lawfulness over theatrics. We chose to be steady, to record our positions, to invite experts, and to protect our people from the collateral harm of hurried ultimatums. That is how a small state preserves its agency, by responding to power with clarity, to pressure with process, and to threats with an open hand that nonetheless will not be taken. My friends, sovereignty is not an abstract slogan. It is the practical condition that allows a people to prioritize the welfare of their own children, heal their wounds, and plan their future without being subject to the whims of distant offices. Putting sovereignty first means that every major decision about defense, trade, finance, or diplomacy is measured against one question: does this strengthen our capacity to decide and act for ourselves tomorrow? If the answer is no, then even the most flattering offer must be weighed against the long arc of independence. Sovereignty first also means treating our institutions as instruments of public service, not as props for short-term gain. We will insist that contracts be transparent, that procurements be auditable, and that policy choices pass through parliaments and independent review. That is not obstruction, it is protection. A nation that builds the habit of scrutiny preserves its right to self-determination. When citizens see decisions made openly and responsibly, the social contract is renewed. When deals are struck in secrecy, sovereignty silently erodes. Putting sovereignty at the center requires economic choices that prioritize resilience. We will diversify markets and suppliers so that no single actor can hold our budget hostage. We will invest in local capacity, technical schools, research centers, maintenance hubs, so that our choices are supported by domestic expertise. This is fiscal sovereignty, the ability to spend, borrow, and plan in ways that reflect our priorities, rather than the conditions of others. It is also social sovereignty, the ability to fund clinics, schools, and safety nets, because we decide their scale and their timing. Sovereignty first demands moral clarity. It rejects deals that trade dignity for short-term advantage. It refuses conditionalities that hollow out national policy or bend institutions to foreign interests. Instead, it seeks partnerships built on reciprocity and respect, arrangements where knowledge transfer, shared risk, and transparent performance bind partners together rather than subjugate one to another. Finally, sovereignty is lived by people, not just by governments. Civic education, an engaged press, and robust civil society are the muscles that keep sovereignty healthy. When citizens understand the stakes and can hold leaders to account, sovereignty is not a chant, but a practiced discipline. We will therefore expand legal literacy, invite oversight, and make the public part of the conversation. To put sovereignty first is not to isolate, it is to choose friends and tools that enlarge our choices, deepen our capabilities, and secure our freedom to decide. It is a daily practice of prudence, transparency, and investment in people. That is the durable foundation of a nation that will stand tall, able to act for its own interests, answer to its own people, and shape its own future. My friends, when tensions rise between nations, words alone will not suffice. What is needed is a plan for conversation that is rigorous, accountable, and repeatable. Offering structured dialogue is not soft diplomacy, it is the hard work of turning disagreement into durable agreement. It means moving from improvised phone calls and public ultimatums to scheduled meetings, clear agendas, expert working groups, and measurable milestones. In doing so, we replace the theater of pressure with the architecture of problem solving. A structured dialogue begins with clarity about who speaks for each side and why. It names delegations with technical expertise, economists who understand the fiscal consequences, defense planners who know operational realities, legal advisors who can translate concerns into terms that courts and contracts understand, and civil society representatives who carry the voice of everyday people. When the right people sit at the table, the conversation becomes practical rather than performative. Next comes an agreed agenda and a timetable. No table can solve all grievances at once. Progress is made by prioritizing issues, setting short-term deliverables, and sequencing harder items for later sessions. We propose joint technical committees with deliverables attached to dates, audits to be completed, data to be shared, and pilot projects to be launched. Every item has an owner and a reporting format so that the talk produces traceable outcomes. Transparency is essential. We insisted that summaries and non-classified minutes be published, so publics on both sides can follow progress. Openness does not mean revealing sensitive operations. It means allowing citizens and parliaments to judge whether negotiations serve the common good. Public visibility also reduces the temptation to use secrecy as a cover for coercion. Accountability mechanisms are baked into structured dialogue. We asked for independent monitors, neutral experts, or trusted multilateral partners who can verify compliance with agreed steps. Where disputes persist, we proposed arbitration panels whose decisions are binding on the negotiated issues. This prevents endless recrimination and creates incentives to implement rather than to delay. Equally important is the inclusion of capacity-building elements. Dialogue should not simply be a list of demands. It must include joint training, shared technical assistance, and exchange programs that address the root causes of disagreement. When one side worries about security or corruption, the other helps build systems that reduce that worry instead of merely promising temperate rhetoric. Finally, structured dialogue honors dignity. It moves us from brinkmanship to brokerage, from headlines to handshakes that matter. It signals that sovereignty and partnership are not opposites but complements, that nations can defend their interests while designing cooperative pathways. Offer structured dialogue, and you convert a crisis into a curriculum for better relations. My friends, drawing red lines is not an act of bravado, it is an act of responsibility. A red line declares what we will not barter away, the core principles that shape a nation's dignity and the protections we owe our people. But drawing lines is only half the work. The other half is the patient, persistent work of resilience, building systems, institutions, and communities that can withstand pressure without shattering. Together, red lines and resilience form a strategy, boundaries that define our values, and capacity that ensures those boundaries are meaningful. A red line must be clear and credible. Vague warnings invite testing, empty threats invite contempt. When we state that certain matters are constitutional order, the inviolability of our borders, the independence of our institutions are non-negotiable, we must back that claim with law, with transparent procedures, and with the public knowledge that these limits are defended not for vanity, but for the common good. Credibility grows when citizens trust that promises are enforceable, when parliaments and courts stand as checks on arbitrary power, and when our conduct is consistent with our words. Resilience is the sinew behind the line. It is the diversity of our trade partners so that no single actor can strangle our economy. It is the robustness of our financial systems so that our banks and businesses do not buckle under external shocks. It is the depth of our supply chains so that when a choke point appears, we have alternatives. It is also social resilience, schools that remain open, health clinics that keep running, and community networks that support families through hard times. Resilience means we plan for disruption and make contingency part of policy, not panic part of politics. Building resilience requires deliberate investments and sober stewardship. It demands honest budgets, anti-corruption measures that close leakages, and investments in human capital so skills are replenished and retained. It requires legal reforms that expedite accountability and procurement standards that favor capacity building over quick fixes. Most of all, it requires civic participation, an informed citizenry that understands the stakes and helps hold leaders to account. Red lines without resilience are threats without teeth. Resilience without red lines is aimless endurance. When combined, they protect liberty and enable action. They tell would-be coercers that persuasion and partnership will be met with openness, but coercion will be met with coordinated response, institutionally anchored and socially supported. This is not belligerence, it is prudence. It is the mature posture of a nation that understands power's limits and its responsibilities. So let us define our non-negotiables with clarity, and let us build the resilience to make them sustainable. Let us craft policies that turn values into durable practices and invest in systems that keep our communities safe when storms arrive. In doing so, we safeguard not only borders and institutions, but the dignity of every citizen who expects that their nation will stand steady and prepared, no matter the hour.